The morning had a sharp bite to it, the kind of cold that crept under wool and settled in the bones. Maren walked along the edge of the village green, with her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. The shawl was old. It had been her mother's before it was hers, and the years had thinned the wool in places where her hands always rested. She could feel the cold air slipping through one such place now, just below her left shoulder, where a small tear had opened that morning when she caught the fabric on the iron latch of the cottage gate. She did not stop to fix it. There were eggs in her basket, 3 of them, wrapped in a bit of cloth, and a small loaf of bread from the baker's wife, who had given her a kind smile and a slightly larger loaf than the coin paid for. Maren had thanked her twice. The baker's wife had waved her off and told her to go home before the cold turned worse. The path from the village led past the iron gates of Ashbourne Hall. Maren did not look at the gates. She had passed them every day for the 3 years she had lived with her aunt in the small stone cottage at the edge of the wood, and she had learned long ago not to look. The gates belonged to a world that had nothing to do with her. The world she belonged to had cracked teacups, a leaking roof, and an aunt who coughed through the long nights and pretended she did not. The wind picked up. A few brown leaves spun across the path. Maren shifted the basket to her other arm and felt the tear in her shawl widen by a finger's breadth. She made a small sound, not quite a sigh, and kept walking. She did not see the carriage at first. It stood just inside the gates of Ashbourne, dark and still, the 4 black horses breathing out small clouds into the cold air. The driver sat very upright on the box, his hands folded over the reins. He did not move. He had been told not to move. Inside the carriage, behind the slim curtain at the window, a man watched her. He was the Duke of Ashbourne, though almost no one in the village had ever seen his face. He had been away for years, in London, in the north, in places that mattered to men who owned half of 3 counties. He had come home only the night before, late, by lamplight, and had risen this morning before the sun to walk the grounds of a house he had not slept in for a long time. The carriage had been ordered for an errand he no longer remembered. He had been on the point of stepping into it when he saw the woman on the path. He had not meant to watch her. He had meant to climb in, give the order, and go. But she had passed within 10 feet of the gate, and something in the way she walked had made him stop with his hand on the carriage door. She walked like someone who had decided long ago not to be looked at. Her head was not lowered, but it was not lifted either. Her step was even. The basket on her arm was balanced with the kind of care that came from having done a thing 1,000 times. Her shawl was a dull brown, and one corner of it lifted in the wind, and he saw the tear at her shoulder. He saw the way she did not stop to mend it. He saw her glance down at it once, the smallest glance, and then square her shoulders and walk on. He stepped quietly back into the carriage and pulled the door almost closed, leaving a thin gap through which he could still watch. He could not have said why. He was a man who had stopped doing things he could not explain to himself, years ago. And yet he stood now in the dim quiet of the carriage and watched a stranger walk past the gates of his own house. She did not pass entirely. A little way down the path, where the hedge gave way to the low stone wall of the chapel garden, she stopped. She set the basket down on the wall with great care. She looked once up the path, and once down it, and once at the chapel windows, which were dark and empty. Then she sat herself on the wall and bent her head to her shoulder. From the small leather pouch at her wrist, she took a needle and a length of thread. The needle was thin, and the thread was the color of old wheat. She did not have a thimble. She pinched the torn edges of the shawl between her fingers and began to sew, her stitches small and even, the needle dipping in and out of the wool with a patience that seemed to belong to a much older woman. The Duke watched her hands. They were not soft hands. Even at this distance he could see that. The knuckles were red from the cold. The fingers were thin and long. They moved with the kind of skill that was not learned at a needlework lesson in a drawing room. They were the hands of a woman who had mended many things in her life and would mend many more. She worked quickly. She did not look up. A small breeze tugged at the loose end of her thread, and she caught it without seeming to think, and went on stitching. Once she pricked her finger. He saw her flinch. a tiny lift of the shoulder. And then she pressed the finger to her lips for the briefest moment and went on. She did not weep. She did not curse. She did not look around to see if anyone had seen her. He understood then why he had stopped. It was not the tear in the shawl. It was the absence of self-pity. She had been alone with that small wound, and she had borne it the way she had borne, he suspected. A great many other wounds. He had spent his whole life among people who could not stub a toe without making a performance of it. He had not known, before this moment, that he was tired of them. The driver shifted on the box, uneasy at the long delay. The Duke lifted one gloved hand a half-inch, and the driver stilled again. She finished the mend. She bit the thread off with her teeth, the way poor women did, and she folded the needle back into her pouch. She smoothed the shawl down with both palms, testing the seam. She nodded once to herself, the smallest nod, as though she were her own master and her own servant and her own only audience. Then she picked up the basket and stepped down off the wall and walked on. She passed out of sight around the curve of the hedge. The Duke stood for a long moment in the dim carriage. Then he opened the door, climbed down, and walked back into his house without giving any order at all. The driver stared after him. The horses stamped. After a while, a footman came and led them away. In the great hall of Ashbourne, the Duke stood under a chandelier that had not been lit for years and looked at nothing. The housekeeper, a thin woman with iron in her hair, came down the long staircase and stopped when she saw him. "Your Grace," she said. He did not turn his head. "Who lives in the stone cottage at the edge of the western wood?" The housekeeper folded her hands at her waist. "A widow, Your Grace." "Mrs. Halliday. She is sister to the late vicar. She has a niece who lives with her." "The niece," he said. "What is her name?" "Miss Maren Calloway, Your Grace." He nodded once. He turned without another word and went up the stairs. The housekeeper looked after him with a small frown. She had served his father and his father's father, and she had learned in those long years to know the difference between a duke who was bored and a duke who had been struck. She knew which she had just seen. She went back to her keys and her ledgers and said nothing to anyone. 3 nights later, the hall was lit for a ball. It had not been planned. The Duke had given the order the morning after he watched the woman mend her shawl, and the household had thrown itself into a panic of polishing and baking and sending out cards. The county had been astonished. The Duke of Ashbourne had not opened his house in 7 years. Some had said he never would. Now the invitations went out in his own hand, and every drawing-room within a day's ride was in a flurry of silk and silver. Maren did not know there was a ball. She did not move in those circles. The invitation, when it came, was carried up the muddy track to the cottage by a footman, in a coat too fine for the place. He stood at the door and held the card out to her with a gloved hand, and she took it with fingers that did not quite tremble. She read it twice. Her aunt, in the chair by the fire, watched her read it. "From the hall?" her aunt asked. "Yes," Maren said. "For you?" "For me." Her aunt coughed, the long dry cough that came every evening now, and pressed a handkerchief to her mouth. "Then you must go." Maren looked at her over the card. "I cannot go. I have nothing." "You have your mother's blue gown." "It is 10 years old, aunt, it is blue," said her aunt, "and it fit her, and it will fit you. And you will be the most honestly dressed woman in that house. Go." Maren said nothing. She turned the card in her hands. It was heavy paper. The ink had been laid down by someone with a steady hand. Her own name was written on it in clear black letters. Miss Maren Calloway. Nobody had written her name like that since the vicar, her uncle, was alive. She put the card on the mantel. She did not say yes. She did not say no. She went out to the kitchen and put the kettle on, and stood for a long time with her hand on the warm iron of the stove, and felt the heat of it bite into her cold palm. She went. She went because her aunt would not let her stay, and because some small stubborn thing in her had decided that she would not be ashamed of an old blue gown in a great house. She brushed it carefully. She mended a loose thread at the cuff. She washed her hair in the basin behind the kitchen screen, and dried it before the fire until it shone the color of dark honey. She had no jewels. She had her mother's wedding ring on a thin chain at her throat. She had her shawl, mended at the shoulder, the seam invisible to anyone who did not know to look. The carriage that came for her was not hired. It was sent. She did not know who had sent it. The driver tipped his hat to her and helped her up and asked no questions. The inside smelled of leather and a faint, clean cold. She sat very still and watched the dark trees go past the window. The hall blazed. She had never seen so much light. Every window on the long front of the house was lit, and the great doors stood open, and the gravel sweep was crowded with carriages, whose lamps glowed like a string of small yellow moons. Inside, the hall floor shone like a pond. Footmen moved through the warmth with trays. Somewhere a violin was tuning, the small thin sound of a single string searching for itself. The smell of beeswax and hothouse roses and warm wine met her at the door and almost made her step back. She did not step back. She gave her name to the man who took the cards. He read it. He looked up at her once, quickly, and looked down again, and announced her in a voice that carried across the hall. Miss Maren Calloway. A few heads turned. Most did not. A girl in a pale pink gown laughed too loudly somewhere by the fire, and the laugh swallowed the small ripple of curiosity. Maren stepped into the hall and felt every nerve in her body settle into a kind of stillness that she had spent years learning. She did not look for anyone. She did not look for him. She walked along the edge of the room as she always walked along the edges of rooms, and she found a corner near a tall window where the heavy curtain made a half wall, and she stood there. The smell of beeswax was very strong here. Someone had polished the floor with it that morning. Under the beeswax was a sharper smell of orange peel, from the hothouse fruit set out in pyramids on the long tables. Under that was the cold, faint smell of stone. Because the window behind her was old, and the cold came through the glass. She watched. She watched the daughters of earls move across the floor, with their gloved hands resting on the arms of young men who looked bored. She watched the older women in their seats by the fire, their fans moving in tiny, precise arcs. She watched the candles burn down by slow degrees, the wax gathering at the cups of the chandeliers in small, pale rivers. She watched a footman bend to pick up a dropped glove and return it to its owner without a word. She did not watch for the Duke. She did not know what he looked like. She had seen, only once, the dark shape of a carriage at the gates of Ashbourne, and even then she had not turned her head. A woman she did not know swept past her in a gown the color of plum-skins. The woman did not look at her. A man she did not know laughed loudly at something near the door. The violin had stopped tuning. It had begun, with two others, to play. Maren took a slow breath and let it out. The seam in her shawl pressed faintly against her shoulder. She put her hand to it without thinking, the small, private gesture of a woman touching a thing she had mended herself. She felt the stitches under her glove. They were even. They held. She did not see across the room the Duke turn his head. He had been speaking to a man older than himself, a baronet from the next county who wanted something about a road. The Duke had been listening with the part of his mind he kept for such things, and the rest of him had been watching the door. He had been watching the door for an hour. He had watched a great many women come through it, and he had felt nothing. Then he had seen her step in. She wore a gown the color of a winter sky in the late afternoon, when the blue has thinned and a little grey has crept into it. The gown was old. He could see that even at this distance. The line of it was 10 years out of fashion. She did not seem to know this. She did not seem to know anything except where her own feet were going. She had walked along the edge of his ballroom the way she had walked along the edge of his hedge. And she had set herself in a corner by the window, and she had laid her hand against her shoulder, where 3 days ago she had set a needle. The baronet was still speaking. The Duke said, "Excuse me." He crossed the room. He did not cross it quickly. He had learned years ago that a duke who moved quickly drew every eye in the place, and he had no wish to draw them now. He moved with the steady walk of a man who was simply going somewhere, and the room parted for him as it always did, without thinking, because that was what rooms did when he walked through them. A woman in pearls turned to greet him, and his eyes did not find her. A young man took a half-step forward to introduce himself, and stopped when the Duke did not slow. A footman with a tray of wine drew silently aside. He came to the corner by the window. Maren did not see him until he was close. When she did not start. She lifted her eyes to his face, and held them there, and waited. He was not what she had expected. She had expected a man like the men she had seen across the room, polished and bored, with a small, careful smile and a way of looking past her. This man did not look past her. He looked at her. His eyes were dark. There were lines at their corners that had not come from laughter, but from looking for a long time at things that needed looking at. He was taller than she was, by half a head. He smelled, very faintly, of cold air and wood smoke, and something underneath that she could not name. "Miss Calloway," he said. His voice was quiet. He said her name the way the housekeeper had said it back to him 3 nights before, with the small, careful weight of a thing recently learned. "Your Grace," she said. She did not curtsy deeply. She bent her knee the proper amount and no more, and rose, and met his eyes again. She had decided, somewhere on the carriage ride, that she would not be frightened in this house. She had not known then that the master of it would be standing 2 feet from her. She found, with some surprise, that the decision still held. "You came," he said. "I was invited," she said. "Yes," he said. "You were. Around them." Very slowly the room began to notice. A head turned, and then another. A fan paused in the middle of its arc. The young woman in plum took a step toward them, and stopped without quite knowing why she had stopped. The Duke of Ashbourne was speaking to a woman no one knew, in a corner by a window, and he was not looking away. Maren felt the eyes. She did not turn toward them. She kept her own eyes on the Duke, and she said, very quietly, "You are kind to greet me." "Your Grace, I am sure there are guests here who have a greater claim on your time." "There are," he said. "I am not interested in them." She did not blink. That is a strange thing to say to a stranger. "You are not a stranger," he said. She tilted her head a small fraction. "I have never been introduced to you." "No," he said. "You have not." He did not explain. He did not say, "I watched you mend your shawl on the chapel wall, and I have not been able to put it out of my mind." He did not say, "I sent the carriage tonight." He did not say, "Your name has been in my head for 3 days like a small, clear bell." He stood with his hands behind his back and looked at her, and she looked at him, and the violins played on, and a 3rd head turned in the room, and a 4th. Then, without lifting his voice, he said, "Will you walk with me?" Maren looked once around the ballroom. She saw the eyes. She saw the young woman in plum, who was now staring openly. She saw an older woman by the fire whisper behind her fan to the woman next to her. She saw a footman pretending not to watch, and watching very carefully. She thought of her aunt by the fire in the cold cottage. She thought of the seam at her shoulder. She thought of the way she had bitten the thread off 3 days ago, alone, on a stone wall, and how she had not known then that anyone had seen. "I will walk with you," she said. He offered his arm. She laid her gloved hand on it, lightly, the way a woman did who knew how to lay a hand on an arm without leaning on it. He turned with her, and they walked together along the length of the ballroom, past the violins and the fire and the woman in plum and the older women with their fans, and they went out through the far door into the long gallery beyond. The gallery was cooler. The candles burned more thinly here. Portraits lined the walls, men and women with the same dark eyes the Duke had, the same straight mouth. Their footsteps echoed faintly on the polished boards. He did not speak. He did not seem to feel that he needed to. After the first surprise of being looked at, Maren found that the silence did not press on her. They came to a tall window at the end of the gallery. He stopped there. He did not let go of her hand. He looked out at the dark park, the long sweep of lawn under the moon, the black shape of the trees beyond. "3 nights ago," he said, "I was standing in my carriage by the gates of this house. I had given an order to go somewhere, and I had forgotten where. A woman passed on the path with a basket on her arm. She stopped at the chapel wall and mended a tear in her shawl, and she did not weep, and she did not look around to see if anyone had seen her. I watched her finish. I watched her bite the thread off with her teeth. I watched her smooth the seam with her hand. Then I came back into the house and asked the housekeeper for her name. Maren did not move. She felt the cold of the window glass through her glove where her free hand had come, without her thinking, to rest against the pane. She felt the warm cloth of his sleeve under her other hand. She felt the seam at her shoulder, the small ridge of her own work. "You watched me," she said. "I watched you. From your carriage. From my carriage," and said nothing. "I did not wish to be seen," he said. "I did not wish then to be a man who watched a woman mend her shawl through a curtain. And now, he said, "I am that man, and I will not pretend I am not." She turned her face from the window and looked up at him. The candle at the wall behind him lit the line of his jaw and left his eyes half in shadow. There was no smile on his mouth. There was no charm. He had not asked her to find him charming. He had told her a true thing, and stood with it in his hands and waited to see what she would do. "You should not have sent the carriage in your own name," she said at last. "I did not send it in my name. You sent it. I sent it." She drew in a small breath. The smell of the cold gallery met her. Beeswax and old wood, and a thin ghost of orange peel from the open door behind. "Your Grace," she said quietly, "I am not a fool. You have set every tongue in your ballroom moving by walking the length of it to find me. You have done it, knowing exactly what it would do. You are not a man who does things by accident. So I will ask you plainly, what is it you want of me?" He was silent for a long moment. He looked down at her hand on his sleeve. Then he looked back up at her face. "I want to be allowed to know you," he said. "That is all. Not tonight. Not next week. In time. Whatever time you give me. I am not asking for an answer. I am asking for permission to ask." She did not answer at once. She looked at him. The candle moved with a small draught, and the shadow on his face shifted, and she saw very briefly that he was tired. Not in the way of a man who had been awake too long, in the way of a man who had been alone too long, in rooms that were full of people, and had only just noticed it. "I will think on it," she said. "That is enough," he said. He did not press her. He did not ask for more. He drew her hand off his sleeve with great care and bowed over it, the small bow of a man returning a borrowed thing, and he gave her hand back to her. Then he stood aside, so that she might walk back along the gallery without his weight beside her, and she did. She heard his footsteps behind her, far enough back that no one watching from the ballroom door would have called them together. By the time she stepped back into the warmth and noise of the ball, he was somewhere behind her in the gallery still, and she was alone, and the eyes that found her now found her unaccompanied, and could make of her what they liked. She did not stay long. She drank 1 cup of warm wine that a footman pressed into her hand. She thanked an older woman who spoke to her, kindly, about the cold. She gave her empty cup back. Then she found the man who took the cards and asked, very politely, if her carriage might be called. He bowed and went, and a quarter of an hour later she was back in the dark and the leather and the clean cold, and the horses were carrying her home. She thought on the ride back that she had perhaps imagined the whole of it. She had not. 5 days after the ball, her aunt's cough was worse, and a doctor came up the muddy track to the cottage that Maren had not sent for and could not pay. He examined her aunt, prescribed a syrup, told Maren to keep the fire high and the windows shut, and left with no mention of a bill. When Maren followed him to the door and asked, in a low voice, what was owed, the doctor only shook his head. "It is settled, Miss Calloway." "By whom?" The doctor looked at her with a kindness that was almost an apology. "I have been asked not to say." He left her in the doorway with the cold coming in around her skirts. She stood there for a long moment. She did not have to wonder. She knew. She did not write to thank him. She did not know how she would have written such a letter. Thank you for buying my aunt's life with money that means nothing to you and everything to me. Every sentence she tried in her head sounded wrong. So she said nothing, and she fed her aunt the syrup, and she sat by the fire at night and listened to the cough soften, slowly, into something less sharp. A week later, walking back from the village, she came again to the chapel wall. She sat down on it without thinking. She felt for the seam at her shoulder. She could no longer tell, by touch through her glove, where the tear had been. A carriage came up the path. It did not stop at the gates of Ashbourne. It came on past the chapel and drew up beside her, and the door opened, and he stepped down. He did not speak at first. He took off his hat. He set it on the seat behind him. He came and stood by the wall, and he looked at her and waited. "You paid the doctor," she said. "I did. I cannot repay you. I did not give it to be repaid. Then I do not know what to do with it." "You do not need to do anything with it," he said. "It is not a debt. It is a thing I wanted to do. I wished it not to come from me, because I did not want you to feel beholden. The doctor was not supposed to leave you wondering. I will speak to him." "He did not tell me," she said. "He kept his word." "I guessed." "How?" "There is no one else who would." He was silent. The wind moved through the bare branches above the chapel wall. Somewhere a crow called once, dryly. The air smelled of wet leaves and cold stone and, very faintly, of the horses standing patient at the carriage. "I have thought on what you asked me," she said. He waited. "You asked permission to ask," she said. "I will give it to you. Not because of the doctor, I want you to know that. The doctor I would have paid one way or another, in time. I give it to you because the night of the ball you told me a true thing, and you did not dress it up. I have known very few people in my life who would do that. I will not waste one of them." He looked at her. The line at the corner of his mouth softened a small fraction. It was not a smile. It was something quieter, the easing of a held breath he had not known he was holding. "Thank you," he said. "Do not thank me yet, Your Grace. I have a condition." "Name it." "You will not send for me," she said. "You will not send carriages or doctors or footmen in fine coats. If you wish to see me, you will come yourself, on your own feet or in your own carriage, and you will come to the door of my aunt's cottage, and you will be a man who has come to call. If you cannot do that, then you cannot do this." He was quiet for a moment. "I can do that," he said. "Good," she said. She rose from the wall. She picked up her basket. He stepped back to let her pass. She walked on along the path toward her cottage, and she did not look back, and behind her she heard the carriage door close softly and the wheels move on toward the hall. He came, the next afternoon, on foot. He left the carriage at the gates and walked the muddy track himself. He came to the door of the cottage with his boots wet to the ankle, and he knocked, and her aunt, sitting up in her chair with a shawl across her knees, looked up at the sound of the knock and looked at Maren and lifted both her brows so high that Maren almost laughed. He had brought no flowers. He had brought a book, a small worn book of poetry, the corners bent from much reading. He gave it to Maren at the door without ceremony. "It is mine," he said. "I do not lend it lightly. Bring it back when you have read it." He stayed an hour. He sat in the second chair by the fire, the chair the vicar her uncle used to sit in, and he answered Maren's aunt's questions with grave courtesy. And he drank a cup of weak tea without making a face, and when he rose to go he bowed to Maren's aunt as though she were a duchess. Her aunt, after he had gone, said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "He is not what I thought he would be." "What did you think he would be?" "A man who would frighten me," her aunt said. "He did not frighten me." Maren turned the small worn book over in her hands. The leather was warm from his pocket. She did not open it that night. She put it on the mantel next to the invitation card from the ball, and she went to bed, and she lay a long time in the dark thinking about the chair the vicar used to sit in, and how it had not been used in 3 years until that afternoon. He came again 3 days later. Then again. Then again. always on foot from the gates, always with something small in his pocket, once a packet of tea, once a wedge of cheese from the dairy, once a pair of warm woolen mittens for her aunt that he said had been made by a woman in the village and would otherwise have gone unsold. He never made a thing of these gifts. He set them on the table and did not look at them. He sat in the second chair by the fire. He talked, sometimes, of small matters of the estate. He listened, more often, to Maren's aunt's stories of the vicar. He learned, without ever asking, how the cottage was run, and where the leak in the roof was, and which of the windows would not close in winter. He did not touch Maren. He did not speak softly to her. He spoke to her as he spoke to her aunt, gravely and honestly. And only when he rose to leave did he meet her eyes for a small clear moment and bow, as he had bowed to her in the gallery on the night of the ball. The village began to talk. It was Maren's misfortune, or perhaps her gift, that she had a cousin on her father's side who had married well. The cousin's name was Lavinia, and she had married a Mr. Pemberton who owned 3 farms and thought himself a great man. Lavinia lived in a tall house on the high street and wore caps trimmed with lace, and considered Maren a thing to be embarrassed by, when she considered Maren at all. Lavinia heard, by the end of the second week, that the Duke of Ashbourne had been seen walking the muddy track to the Halliday cottage. She heard it from her maid, who had heard it from the baker's wife, who had heard it from her own husband, who had seen the Duke's boots on the path with his own eyes. Lavinia spent 2 days in a state of held breath, waiting for the rumour to die. When instead it grew, she ordered her gig, put on her best pelisse, and drove out to the cottage herself. She arrived on an afternoon when the Duke was already there. Maren opened the door to her cousin's sharp knock with the small bend of patience that Lavinia always summoned in her. Lavinia stepped in without waiting to be asked. She saw the Duke in the second chair by the fire. She did not curtsy at once. She stood very still in the middle of the small room, her gloved hands clutching her reticule, and her face went through 3 colours before it settled on a hot pink. "Your Grace," she said. The Duke rose. He bowed. Mrs. Pemberton. He knew her name. Maren did not know how he knew her name. He had perhaps asked the housekeeper, who knew everyone. Lavinia recovered herself in a great rush of words. She had come, she said, to call upon her dear cousin. She had not known there was company. She would not stay long. She was naturally delighted to meet the Duke at last. She had heard such things. She had hoped, she had hoped, that some day the family would have the honour of receiving him. Though, of course, she added with a small high laugh, this was not quite the family seat. This was only poor dear Aunt Halliday's little cottage. Her own house, in the village, was rather more suited to such a guest, if His Grace would ever do them the honour. The Duke listened to all of this with a polite, immovable face. When Lavinia had finished, he said, "I am well suited here, thank you, Mrs. Pemberton." Lavinia's smile flickered. She turned the smile on Maren. "My dear," she said, "you look quite tired. You have been working too hard, I am sure. It is so good of His Grace to take pity on you in this dreadful little house. Although, you know, dear, we have spoken often, His Grace and I have not, but I have spoken often with my husband, that perhaps it would be better if you came to live with us in town. It would relieve poor Aunt Halliday of the burden. And you would have at least a gown that was made in this century." She laughed her high small laugh again. The room went very quiet. Maren's aunt, in her chair, set her cup down on the small table with a sharp little sound. Maren did not move. She felt for an instant the old familiar lift of shame in her chest, the burn of it climbing into her face. She did not let it climb. She breathed it down. She set her hands very lightly on the back of the chair before her. She did not look at the Duke. "Lavinia," she said, in a voice that was perfectly level, "Aunt Halliday is not burdened by me. I am not burdened by my gown. And you are not welcome to speak of either as though they were a charity case at your gate. If you wish to call upon me again, you will write before you come, and you will not bring this kind of talk into this house. Do you understand?" Lavinia's mouth opened. She had not in all her life been spoken to in this voice. She looked for help at the Duke. The Duke said nothing. He stood beside the fire with his hands behind his back and watched Maren as though she were the only person in the room. There was no anger in his face. There was only a deep, very quiet attention. He did not move to defend her. He did not need to. She had not asked him to. Lavinia tried for a recovery. "My dear, I only meant, I know what you meant," Maren said. "Goodbye, Lavinia." Lavinia opened her mouth again. Then she closed it. She gave a stiff, small curtsy in the general direction of the Duke. She turned and went out the door, and they heard her gig rattle away down the muddy track at a speed that suggested her driver had been hurried. The room stayed quiet. Maren's aunt, after a long moment, picked her cup up again. "Well," she said, "that was overdue." The Duke had not taken his eyes from Maren. Maren turned and met them. The shame was gone. The burn had cooled. In its place was a strange, clean steadiness she had not felt in a long time. "I am sorry," she said to him. "You should not have had to hear that." "I am not sorry," he said. "I am grateful she came." "Grateful?" "I have wanted for some time to know how you would handle her," he said. "Now I know." She looked at him a moment longer. Then she did something she had not done. She smiled. It was a small smile, half rueful, half tired, and it lasted perhaps 2 seconds. He saw it. He kept the memory of it in him afterward, as a man keeps a coin in his pocket and touches it now and then with his thumb to be sure it is still there. He took his leave shortly after. He bowed to her aunt. He bowed to Maren. He went out into the cold afternoon and walked the muddy track back to the gates of Ashbourne with his hands deep in his pockets and his hat pulled low, and the housekeeper, watching him come up the drive from a high window, saw that he was, for the first time in 7 years, walking the path of his own house as though he meant to stay on it. It was a fortnight after that when Maren heard, through the baker's wife, the story of the lame boy. The lame boy was the son of a tenant on the Ashbourne lands. He had been kicked by a cart horse a year before, and his leg had set badly, and he walked now with a heavy lean and a stick. The baker's wife told Maren, over the counter and in a low voice, as though she were sharing something she had not been sure she should share, that a London doctor had been sent for from the city, and had come down by post-chaise, and had spent 2 days at the boy's cottage examining the leg, and had rebroken and reset the bone, and had stayed a 3rd day to be sure the splint held. The doctor had been paid by the Duke. The Duke had not visited the cottage. The Duke had not been seen there at all. The doctor, when pressed, had said only that he had been engaged by a private gentleman who wished to remain so. But the boy's mother had wept on the baker's wife's shoulder in the market, and had told her that she had written 1 letter, 6 months ago, to the Duke at his London house, and had heard nothing, and had given up hoping. The letter had not been forgotten. It had only been held until the Duke was home and could see to the matter himself. The baker's wife pressed Maren's hand and said, "He is not the man we thought, Miss Calloway." "No," said Maren slowly. "He is not." She walked home along the muddy track with a loaf of bread under her arm and her shawl pulled close against the cold. She thought of the second chair by the fire. She thought of the small worn book of poetry on her mantel. She thought of the doctor who had not been allowed to speak of, who had paid him. She thought of a boy somewhere in a cottage on Ashbourne land who would walk straight again because of a letter that had not been forgotten. She did not tell the Duke that she knew. She did not need to. It was not for telling. That night, after her aunt was asleep, she sat by the fire alone and opened the small worn book of poetry for the first time. She read 3 poems. She read a 4th. On the inside of the back cover, in a hand that was not the Duke's, in faded brown ink, someone had written a single line, "For my son, who is not as cold as he pretends." She closed the book. She held it on her lap. She sat for a long time looking into the fire. She understood then why he had given her this book and not another. He had not given it as a present. He had given it as evidence. He had given it as a man who suspected he might not be able to say a true thing about himself out loud, and had handed her, instead, a thing that someone else had said about him long ago. She went to bed. She slept badly. In the morning she put on her shawl and walked out along the muddy track, and at the gates of Ashbourne she did not turn aside. She went in. The footman at the door did not know what to do with her. She gave her name. She asked to see his grace. The footman bowed and went away and came back and bowed her in. The Duke was in the library. The library was a long room with tall shelves and a fire burning low. He was standing at the window when she came in. He turned when the door opened. He did not speak. She walked the length of the library and stopped in front of him. She held the small book out to him on her open palm. "I have read it," she said. "And? I am bringing it back." He took the book. He did not open it. He set it on the small table beside him. He waited. She drew in a slow breath. "I came," she said, "because I have been thinking. You asked me, at the ball, for permission to ask. I gave it to you. I gave it with a condition, and you have kept the condition. You have walked the muddy track in every kind of weather. You have sat in my uncle's chair and drunk my aunt's weak tea. You have brought small things and made nothing of them. You have not touched my hand except to bow over it. You have paid a doctor who you did not want me to know about. And you have set a boy's leg 6 fields away, whose mother does not know your face, and you have not spoken of any of it to me. I have been thinking what I should do with a man like that." He did not move. He did not breathe, she thought, for the length of one heartbeat. "And," he said again, very low, "and I have decided," she said, "that I will not waste you." She felt the words leave her, and felt the small ground under her feet steady itself as they did. She did not lower her eyes. She did not lift her chin. She stood as she had stood on the chapel wall mending her shawl, with her shoulders square and her hands honest at her sides, and she let him see her decide. He took a half-step toward her. He stopped. He looked at her as though he wished to be sure he had heard. "Say it again," he said, "if you will." "I will not waste you," she said, "and I will not let you waste me either. If you want this, what we have been doing, this slow, careful thing, you may have it, but not as a secret, not in corners, not with my cousin's whispers in the village and the older women behind their fans at the hall. If you wish to court me, you will court me where the same people who saw you walk the length of your ballroom can see you do it again. I will not hide. I will not be hidden. I do not wish to hide you," he said. "I have never wished to hide you." "Then it is settled. It is settled." He did not embrace her. He did not bend to her mouth. He did, instead, what he had done in the gallery on the night of the ball. He took her hand, very carefully, in both of his. He looked down at it. He turned it over so that the palm was upward. The glove she wore had been mended at the wrist, a small, careful stitch where the seam had begun to go. He looked at the stitch for a long moment. He did not speak of it. He lifted her hand and laid it against his cheek. It was the first time she had felt his face without a glove between them. His skin was cold from standing at the window. The bone of his cheek was firm under her palm. He closed his eyes for a moment, and she saw, in the small movement of the lashes, that this was a thing he had not let himself do for a very long time. Close his eyes in front of another person. When he opened them again, he set her hand gently back at her side, and he stepped back. "Will you stay to dinner?" he said. "My aunt, I have already sent a footman with a basket and a girl to sit with her. I sent them when the footman came to tell me you were here. You may go to her at any moment if you wish." She looked at him. The corner of her mouth turned up a fraction. "You are very sure of yourself, Your Grace." "I am very sure of you," he said. She stayed to dinner. They were married in the spring. The wedding was small by the standards of dukes. It was held at the chapel by the wall where she had once mended her shawl, and the village came in its best. And her aunt was carried up in a hired chair with a wool rug across her knees, and sat in the front pew weeping quietly into a handkerchief, and smiling at the same time. Lavinia was not invited. Lavinia heard about the wedding from her maid, and took to her bed for a week. The Duke arranged, quietly, that the small pension Maren's aunt had been struggling to live on should be doubled out of his own pocket, and he arranged it through the parish so that it should look as though it had always been so. Maren's aunt never knew. The cough, in the warmer months, eased, and did not return as badly the next winter. And Maren's aunt lived to see the first child born, and to hold him in her arms by the fire in the cottage that her niece, now a duchess, refused to let her leave. A year and a little after the ball, Maren stood at the tall window at the end of the long gallery in Ashbourne Hall. She wore a gown that was not 10 years old. The seam at the shoulder of her old brown shawl was still invisible to anyone who did not know to look. The shawl was folded now in a chest in her dressing room, and she did not wear it often, but she did not give it away. She kept it because her mother had given it to her, and because she had mended it herself on a stone wall on a cold morning when she had not known anyone in the world was watching. She heard his step in the gallery behind her. She knew the step. She did not turn. He came up behind her and stood a small distance off, the proper distance of a man who had learned, over a year, that she liked to be approached and not surprised. After a moment she felt his hand settle, light as a leaf at the small of her back. "You are thinking," he said. "I am." "Of what?" "Of the carriage at the gates," she said. "And the curtain." "And whether, if you had not stopped that morning, any of this would have come to be." He was quiet. "It would have come to be," he said. "I am very certain it would have come to be." "How can you be certain?" "Because I would have stopped some other morning," he said. "I had been waiting, I think, all my life to stop. I did not know it then. I know it now." She turned, at last, and looked up at him. The lines at the corners of his eyes had not gone. They had only softened. He smelled, still, of cold air and wood smoke, and something underneath that she could now name. She put her hand to his cheek as she had done in the library a year before. He closed his eyes for a moment, just as he had then. Outside the window, far across the park, a girl was walking along a path with a basket on her arm. She was a kitchen maid, going down to the village on an errand. She wore a shawl. The shawl did not have a tear in it. Maren watched her cross the gravel and pass through the gates and turn onto the path that led past the chapel wall. She watched until the girl was out of sight around the curve of the hedge. She turned back to him. "Come," she said. "Our son is awake. He will want you. He will want you," he said. "He will want us both." He smiled, the small, slow smile that almost no one in the county had ever seen, and he gave her his arm, and she laid her gloved hand on it lightly, the way a woman lays a hand on an arm without leaning on it. And they walked together along the long gallery, past the portraits of his fathers and his mothers, toward the warmer rooms beyond, where a fire was burning and a small voice was calling, and where, on the mantel above the hearth, a small worn book of poetry stood between two candlesticks, with a faded line of brown ink inside the back cover that nobody but the two of them would ever read again. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. If this moved you, please like, share and subscribe. Your support keeps these stories alive.